And welcome to Conservatives Talk.
And on this special episode, we got a lot to unpack right now. So first off, ding dong, Roe is dead. Ding dong, Roe is dead.
His feet's actually kicking on the table right
now. It's a exciting time to be in America right now.
Exactly.
Also, we're going to, talk about how May issue is now unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
Then we're going to lead into the U.S. Congress, showing us why democracies always fail. And sadly enough, once again, glad to be in a republic, even though they're not treating it like it.
Exactly.
And we're going to kind of close out because Buck's got some proof as to why Biden really is senile.
You're not going to want to miss this. And welcome to Conservatives Talk. My name's Justin.
And this is Jamie.
And like always, whenever you see any of our content out there, always make sure you hit the like and the subscribe button. That way, anything that you see coming out there and anything that you see that's put out on social, by liking and subscribing to all the content there, you're essentially allowing us to be placed higher into all of the essentially higher into the news feed and be able to really spread this out. Make sure you share it as well. That's a major contributor into it also. And go to our website there on the screen, conservativestalk.org, and hit the sponsor tab in the upper right-hand corner and the lower right-hand corner and help us out with what you can. Every bit of our sponsorships go a massively long way into helping us being able to continue to produce these, continue to spread these, continue to share these, and really getting this message out as far and wide as possible. So please, if you're able to, go to our website and hit those sponsor tabs and really be able to help us to push our message for this.
Yeah, and whether you like us or hate us, please continue to comment because it always helps. And can I do my favorite part now?
Let's do it.
142 days until we beat Stacey Abrams.
Oh man, it
wait.
never gets old.
Never gets old. It'll never get old. Especially seeing as, she still has yet to concede from last time. So beating her again and making it known. I wonder if she'll concede this time. Narcissists continue to repeat the same pattern. So
probably it's also the definition of insanity,
which is most of the Democratic Party. And if they were not insane before,
after today, they most certainly are going to.
Oh yeah.
As said, Roe is dead.
Roe is dead.
Abortion or the constitutionally protected right to abortion is no longer. It never was, in all honesty, but under the newest ruling, was it in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the Supreme Court came back and made the announcement that the right to abortion under the substantive due process claim is false.
Which is where it should have been. This is, yes. Here's the thing. It's a state rights issue.
Oh, absolutely. It's always been.
I think, not being a lawyer, but I think they made the right legal decision.
But you did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
I slept at a Motel 6. I had to stay, in another city. I'm just glad to be back in Georgia for a whole week. Anyway, so I'm excited. I know the left is like spewing, and I think it's
they've actually called for a night of rage.
Yeah, like what was so funny was a friend of mine kind of sent that to me, and he said, "So riot season starts early this year."
Well, it's about when it started in 2020.
Yeah, it's June.
About the summer of love.
No, it's June.
Well, actually, they got a little late start.
Yeah, because that was after Independence Day, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So it's first I will say kudos to our justices and for sticking tough, because for the first time, as we discussed previously, and as everyone probably knows now, we had the leak of what the decision was going to be, and that was an intimidation tactic Justice Kavanaugh was threatened. Someone came to
Oh, yeah.
was at his house, threatening to kill him. So they still stood tall and tough on what they believed in, and was able to make the right call. So now this kind of goes down to the states
Mhm.
and state law, which is where it always should have been.
They came out today and said that they are going to be organizing and rallying outside of Justice Thomas's house tonight.
Oh, happy birthday, Justice Thomas.
Oh yeah, it's our Georgia boy.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So a little bit about or a little bit of the information behind this. Essentially, Mississippi had passed a law that limited abortions up until a certain point, which was less than what the constitutional doctrine in Roe v. Wade had decided, or at least the point of viability that they had determined at that point in time, which frankly nowadays viability is a much earlier stage. But they made the decision that if a fetus is not viable to live outside of the mother's body, then the mother has the privacy right to be able to terminate that pregnancy. That privacy right is something that, quite frankly, is or the right to privacy. There is nowhere in our Constitution that even is not as explicitly stated, nor is it directly inferred. So it comes from essentially the right not to have your home searched without a warrant. That's where your right to privacy comes from.
That's where we
That's
imply
it.
it from.
Yes.
Which is also the scary slip that I always talk about because it goes back to the NSA and everything else.
Mhm.
We have this false sense of security in our minds because we feel that we have a right to have certain things private when that was never the government's intention, which is also even scarier. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, at that point in time, when the Constitution was written, they never
They had
it,
any idea that any of this was going to
exactly
be
that the information and technology would be so advanced to this level that that need would be needed to be protected.
it was unfathomable. Plus, we're
Yes.
talking about, I mean, just being honest, it was the 1800s. They took their buckets of poop out to the street and dumped them. Like, you know what I mean? Like there
Hey, they
was
had outhouses.
okay. Then when you clean out the outhouse, like that's what ends up happening. Like, you know what I mean? Or you had like the advanced people had latrines up under their
Mhm.
outhouse, but then you still had to move the outhouse when you capped the 14 feet deep of feces. Like
Yeah,
it wasn't fathomable the issues that we would have because you just never would imagine that so many people would be in other people's business.
exactly. And it's interesting to note that not only was this this perceived constitutional right derived for something that had absolutely nothing to do with what it was quote unquote derived from, but there have been other Supreme Court rulings that have been derived from this as well, which quite frankly, Justice Thomas came out and said, look, because of this ruling today, it opens up the avenue for a lot of these other cases. And one of those being is the Obertefell case.
Yeah. I don't know. This whole thing, it's a slippery slope, which is I understand a lot of people's concerns, and here's kind of my thing, right? Um, I believe that life starts at contraception.
Conception.
Conception.
Contraception means the preventing of.
Cut that out. I believe that life starts
Conception.
at conception.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about that part, to me though, is like everyone's upset about I don't know all that. We will never experience any of that.
Hey,
As
don't you
men.
misgender me, okay?
Okay. Anyway, we will never understand, like, you know what I mean, like some of the sentiment, and I do respectfully understand that, but based upon just what my beliefs are, I feel that that is something that needs to be done at a state level more so than a federal level, allowing for, because each state, each the values with inside the community of each state were all made up differently. And that just goes back to the original point of, you have the freedom to go wherever you want to. If you know don't like the laws with inside your state, then by God, lobby against it and put somebody up or vote somebody out or move, you know. But I think the values that we hold in Georgia are being upheld, and now we have the ability to continue to uphold them instead of getting sued for a righteous bill
Hmm.
that was put in place based upon the value of the majority of Georgians.
Yes, and I mean that does not, uh, and that mentality does not take away from the idea of essentially what would be the constitutional idea of of the supremacy clause, meaning that if the federal government actually wanted to make this legal nationally, they could,
Yeah.
but they don't have the votes because the American populace overall, or the American populace within its representatives, do not have they don't have the numbers to be able to pass that and to make that law.
Yeah.
So it is a reflection of what the representative majority of Americans want.
Absolutely. And we're going to dabble into that portion because you said
Hmm.
some very key things later on. But the part of this key to me, and it's just not a believer. I feel like this is a big major win for conservative values, and whether, regardless what you believe in or not, this is what we mean when this is a state rights issue, and this is something that is supposed to be personal. So I think that's part of the misunderstanding of this conversation, is that because it's so personal, this should be done in your community, and the community you choose to live in is the one who should set these rules, not the federal government.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with you 100% on that one. Well, it shouldn't be perceived as an absolute right when it's not there to begin with, because the federal government does have the ability and the authority to make that law and make that determination and that ruling. But it should not be construed from the ultimate founding document that enshrines and protects our rights and our civil liberties.
I see what you're going to. It's to a certain degree.
It is not part of our founding bedrock. And the Supreme Court today came out and said that no, it is not.
Hmm, slightly a rabbit hole,
Oh.
because now you got me thinking about privacy, because it's always an understanding. So if we actually went back and made privacy constitutional, that wipes out the NSA, that wipes out, essentially, that makes this a whole nother level
Mhm.
of terms. Um, puts a whole nother twist on this. But that's interesting because now, like, what I mean? Like, you have it, your mind works completely different than mine. Um, and yours is more of a legal sense. You worked at a law firm, those kinds of things. So when I start to think about the way you just phrased that, I'm really thinking more of, maybe that could be the one of the next movements, is about privacy becoming part of the bedrock of our foundation as a country.
And then a constitutional amendment being the only means of that,
Correct.
or a federally passed law being the only means of that happening,
Yeah.
or at least for it becoming the bedrock, it would have to be a constitutional amendment. But it could be a a national uh, law if Congress
Yeah,
does
well,
take that up.
yeah, well, I'm thinking, when I'm you had me thinking more so long of, what would it be, the
Mhm.
27th Amendment? Like, because again, I'm very opposed to invasion of privacy. The
Oh, absolutely.
I talk about it every time, like, really the last couple shows I've talked about, you know, the Patriot Act and how it had its good parts and its bad
Mhm.
parts, and NSA being one of the worst parts of it. Like, I think all that, if we really want to encapsulate where we're going, now's the time to really start pushing for, people having their right to privacy and get our right. I'll say that next portion for later because I just realized there's another part of a segment.
Yeah, I mean, that would be an interesting one. We've seen movements such as this coming that have come down the pipeline. We've seen a lot of things that are these movements that try to make things constitutional. Get a lot of attention and a lot of fervor behind them. Pick up a lot of steam and really get close to actually crossing that major threshold via either Congress proposing the amendment or through the process of the Convention of States. But I mean, ultimately, in all honesty, that's how we even got the 17th Amendment was because there
Yeah.
were so many states that ratified their resolutions calling for this convention to be held. But anyway, it's such a major hurdle for that to actually overcome that it's unlikely, especially nowadays when things are so polarized,
Correct.
that frankly, I don't see an avenue for it to happen, which is a good safeguard in this instance.
Well, and so for this instance, it works, and then again, when we start talking again about privacy, I think that things like that, n- privacy, need to be an amendment because of how methodical we have to be in the thought process of making them amendments to the Constitution versus just being a federal law, as we clearly see with a lot of things that are going on or a lot of things that have been attempted. Um, Federal law, it is emotional to a degree and very polarized, especially the
Mhm.
more we look at I guess you could say,
I want to
how
do a
Democrats have
direct
been
quote with
done.
this.
Because
Uh,
the Democrats have basically just proven to us that, well, we'll take the majority and then we'll pass whatever we want to
mhm.
based upon how we feel as a party in that decade.
No, no, no. You're absolutely correct with that.
What are you
Uh,
about to quote?
where's it at? Sorry, this thing's moving a little slow right now. Okay, so specifically want to quote this because the understanding behind this and just reading it in the most broadly construed mindset would ultimately you would think a lot of the things that were passed within the Patriot Act would be considered unconstitutional. So this is the Fourth Amendment. The right to the people or the right of the people shall be secured in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describe the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So without an actual warrant that was issued, and where we got the FISA courts in
Hmm.
order to be able to
Hmm.
issue these secret warrants. They
Hmm.
did this in the name of national security.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, like
And this is where,
it's not even really a conspiracy, but like conspiracies have like been dabbled off of this. Like
mhm,
they call it the secret courts or whatever. But similar to like a regular warrant, like you can there is a prosecutor who goes before a judge, asks for a warrant, then the warrant is served, and then someone is swatted. Um, that is how some things have happened. And though to a certain degree, it has been very valued, and a lot of it goes unknown because there are certain levels of security when it comes to terrorist acts that
mhm,
the everyday person will never know, which is very good for the country because some things, if we knew if every person knew every situation that every high ranking person, as far as inside the government or well known person, went through, like, there's a reason why they have private securities and things of that nature. Like it could really mess with people's minds, right? That alone is scary to some, but there is a reason why we have due process.
mhm. And the Fifth Amendment codifies due process and being
Yep.
able to have that. But so the the decision in Roe relies heavily on the Fourth Amendment, and it relies heavily on this essentially that
So explain that.
you'll be able to have security within the persons, meaning that you'll be able to have the it's kind of where the right to privacy comes from.
Okay.
Anything that you have on your personal effect is not subject to any sort of unwarranted searches and seizures. That's where a lot of this comes through.
Okay.
However, it's they construed this as, or they interpreted it as, you have to have, or you would have your person who would be not be subject to governmental regulations. But in the actual amendment, it says unwarranted searches and seizures, not regulation.
I see what you're saying.
So any sort of law in regard to abortion is not constitutional whatsoever.
Because it's regulation.
Exactly.
And so because it's a federal law and the federal law technically is from the federal regulations book, it's unconstitutional. But if it was inside the state, then there would have to be something warranted.
No.
Okay, please, because
So-
look,
so
some of the
with-
questions
with-
that I
with
have, or some of this, yeah,
So with the idea behind substantive due process, it's essentially something that is an inferred process or an inferred rights that you would have. It's not actually something that's enumerated within the Constitution. It's not actually something that is spelled out. It's something that you come up with based upon other things that are in the Constitution.
okay,
So the Fourth Amendment saying that you would be able to have security within the persons uh, against unwarranted searches and seizures.
so they can't just come in.
They can't just come in and search you
and search you
without having a warrant.
Yeah, without having a warrant, without
Yes.
having probable cause of any kind.
Yes. Well, the warrant has to be issued based on probable cause.
Okay.
So, but in certain circumstances, you do have categories to where officers can move in without a search warrant with probable cause, just simply because they believe that
It's like
evidence
yeah,
can be destroyed during that point in time that they don't have that ability to move in on it.
which is like with a moving vehicle,
Yes.
because with a moving vehicle, you can.
Or if you're in there, if they essentially hear they're there because they suspect this is a drug house, and then you have 4 officers show up there. They don't have a warrant. They just chased a known drug dealer in, and they start hearing the toilet flush.
Yeah.
They can go in.
Yeah, because or like if they see something through the window, like
Yes.
if the blinds are open, it's
Mhm.
visible. That in itself is probable cause. If you're inside of a moving vehicle, there's probable cause to a certain degree there, because you have the ability to flee
Mhm.
and do something of that nature.
Although it's significant to note that probable cause is substantially reduced if they lose sight of you.
I've heard that.
It's true.
Interesting.
Because then at that point in time, who's to say that there wasn't another exact make and model of your vehicle to pull off into the road that car that they were chasing was turning down. But
That's
that's
interesting.
another
That's the whole. Let's get out of that rabbit hole.
So essentially, what this is doing is it is moving back towards original intent behind what the Constitution was saying and what it was moving towards, as opposed to the term and the notion of what is called judicial activism. Essentially, it's legislating from the bench, making up laws and regulations and rules from the bench, as opposed to allowing the legislative process to go through.
Now I understand, because part of this, right, is when you look at the makeup of the Supreme Court now, you have a lot more, and I'm definitely going to butcher this part. I think you have the constitutionalists, right, who are more for original intent. And then you have those who just interpret it based upon their interpretation, which is more along the lines of an emotional thing.
Well, I would say
give me the
usual their moral standards that they hold within themselves, as opposed to actually ruling based upon what the law says and what it is. They're ruling because they are construing and creating the law based upon what they think it needs to be,
Gotcha.
as opposed to what it actually is.
Gotcha. Because I was more, so when you do poli sci classes, you got to take it constitutional law, right? Because our baseline theory in the U.S. from
Hmm.
poli sci perspective is, of course, based on the Constitution. Um, so I have very like very little, not even enough to be dangerous, but so I'm understanding now because I remember that from class when we were talking about like you have two different types of attorneys who view it, and we had this going joke because I did mock trial for a little while about that's slide story. The attorney who came in and who was our mock trial instructor told us, he says, well, if y'all choose to go to law school, he says, A's are going to be judged. Your people in law school who get A's, they're going to be judges. The ones who get B's are going to be prosecutors, and C's, well, $1 million ain't bad. And so he was trying to interpret, like, he was trying to tell us, like when you're standing before a judge, it's good to know who you're standing in front of, because that's how they're going to interpret it, which better makes you build your defense or your case, because that's how they're going to look at it, either based on the letter of the law, or do some research on how this judge feels, or what his previous decisions were, if he is
Hmm.
a little bit different minded.
That has a significant role in playing, especially when we see the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices.
Mm-hmm.
You see all the senators get up there on the Judicial Committee and hammer down on these nominations, or these nominees, that what their previous rulings were, why they ruled that way, if they still felt that way. Because as politicians rule on emotion, not law. They make
Correct.
law. Judges are there to ultimately interpret the law and in what they're not able to enforce, but they're there to interpret the law. The executive branch is there to enforce the law. So,
And that's
and that's actually something Jackson said
yeah,
about a Supreme Court ruling. He said, "All right, they've made their ruling. Now let's see them enforce it."
yeah. And so that's interesting, because as a political strategist, we start talking about when confirmations happen, things like that at all levels. You want your politician to be someone who is tough and firm, but ask leaning questions, because leaning questions lead into insight into
So
what
not
the judge
leaning
might do.
questions, leading questions.
No, leaning. Like so here's the difference, right? You want it to, like, leading is, you want it to lead towards something.
You're asking them a question uh, in a specific manner to have them answer a way that you want them to answer.
Well, that's leading.
Yes,
Leaning is, I need them to, well, yeah. Yeah.
I got you. It's leaning based upon the
The
political
political view
position
that it
of
is.
that
I
politician.
Sometimes I
I
have to
got you.
stop myself before I give myself away too much.
Yeah, it happens to us
I'm
all.
sitting here thinking, I was like, I shouldn't say that, because this is going to go out to everyone, and then you might infer some things that are being done. So,
Well,
but yeah,
let's take a stab at the next one. Of course, uh, the big issue is that there was a massive ruling, and what was it? It was the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. Um, Essentially, what it was that the um, the city of New York had a 100-year long statute that had a may issue permit. They were a may issue state. So may issue states are states that say, okay, well, you can apply for a permit to be able to carry a concealed firearm in public. Then you have to come back and prove why you need this firearm to be able to protect yourself. And then you had a very broad discretion from local authorities that were able to essentially say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Throw it out.
New York City was very bad about
Oh,
this.
yes, very, very. All of New York was actually.
Well, especially in the city, though, because in New York City, basically, to get a permit, you had to not only know someone,
Mhm.
but you had to be extremely wealthy and it was almost like a favor swap.
Yeah, that's
That's
that's a
that's the best way to put it. It was a
mhm.
favor swap. If you in New York City, if you knew someone who was very high up and you could do them a favor, or you were coming into the country for a little while, then you could do do a favor and get a permit. It was very rare that even if you were a US citizen going to New York and spending time that you would get a permit regardless of what you could do. Um, but
Oh yeah, because there are states where you don't actually have to live there to be able
correct,
to have a concealed carry permit there.
correct. New York was a very big one.
Mhm.
Um,
Uh, they actually arrested people in the airport from flying from or people were flying, for instance, to go hunting, deer hunting in Maine, and they had a layover in New York. Well, if you were flying from Texas into New York, then and you didn't have a licensure within the state of New York, they were going to arrest you at the airport.
yep.
So, I mean, that's essentially where they fell on these lines of firearms. So, what they did was the Supreme Court, and this ruling was handed down by our boy, uh, Justice Thomas. He the ruling essentially said that they were not able to have these may issue permits simply because it violated the person's Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms. And based upon the previous DCV Heller, which is where Scalia handed down the opinion saying that firearms were a deeply held, or the personal protection was a deeply held and fundamental right of American society. So the Second Amendment, and they ruled that for the federal government, and then there was a subsequent case based out of California, or no, excuse me, out of Chicago, actually, that there was a 30-year handgun ban that had been established in Chicago,
Mhm.
where they applied the 14th Amendment to the DCV Heller ruling, and it made it national because the DCV Heller was specifically for DC only. It was only national. So that subsequent ruling made it applicable to the states.
Explain that to me for a little bit because I remember the 30-year ban coming through because that was real big.
Mm-hmm.
That's around the time that Chicago started to get real bad and why and my community, African American community, my community started being referring to Chicago as Chirac because at that point, right, in low income housing areas, what started to happen was that's where guns started to be moved. Similar with the crack epidemic when it happened, when there was a vacuum in the market, it was easier because a lot of people who were doing this could go away to places that most of the people that they knew were not going to see them, and then they would dump it there or meet there to pick it back up or sell it to someone, which is why you start to see these large criminal organizations start to pop up in these low income areas. And so the 30-year gun ban is what led to Chirac, essentially. Explain how they applied, in your opinion, the 14th Amendment to make that national. That's something that I don't know.
So DCV Heller, the ruling in DCV Heller, they had essentially had in the District of Columbia had made it to where you could not own a handgun in the District of Columbia.
Mhm.
Heller Heller filed a lawsuit and won that case in the Supreme Court because ultimately a handgun is the best line of defense that you have within your home.
Yeah.
So by having or so that ruling was construed to within the home, not applicable to being out in public.
Like in your vehicle, being able to carry it with
Yes.
you, anything like that. If you had it in
Mhm.
your house, then you were fine.
Yes, and by extension, your vehicle being an extension of your house up into a certain point.
Yes.
So that's what that ruling did. So then, 2 years later, in 2010, there was a lawsuit that had been filed to overturn Chicago's handgun ban.
Mhm.
So you had the case because the District of Columbia being exclusively um, federal. That case only applied to DC because it was only applied federally. So the case in Chicago then applied or they filed the case to have the ruling in DC v. Hellard incorporated nationally under the 14th Amendment. Because the 14th Amendment is essentially what you have with the incorporation part of it, talking about all states have to follow the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So by having that ruling coming in with the 14th Amendment or having that incorporated under the 14th Amendment, you are essentially asserting that every household in the entire country is legally able to have a firearm in it,
I see what you're saying.
but only in the house.
Because that's how they linked them with DC, which even though it is not a state in a sense, when they attached it to the Chicago case, because Chicago is inside the state of Illinois, all that kind of stuff, it came out that way then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that way they could make the law apply across the country.
Yes, nationally. So by this ruling coming out the way it does, it essentially says that the may issue standard or the local determination of whether or not you can have a handgun publicly is, and especially the very broadly construed requirements are the for local authorities to be able to turn it down just wantonly, made it unconstitutional based upon the Second Amendment. So this will allow every state in the entire country to become at a bare minimum a shall issue state. So there are right now 17 shall issue states. So by incorporating this ruling nationally, you will have 25 shall issue states at a bare minimum. So essentially what a shall issue state is as long as you meet the requirements, meaning like you're of a certain age, you pay the fee, you do the background check,
you do the class or whatever. Yeah.
If that's a state law,
yeah.
yes, then they have to issue permit. It's not a local authority's ability to determine or to say, well, you don't really need one. They no longer have that ability to say that. It's if you meet the requirements, you can get one. So the big issue that they're saying that this is going to bring about is it's really going to increase gun violence across the country. So it's funny to note that 3 of the 8 may issue states already actually 4 of the 8 may issue states already have or I'm calling DC a state at this point in time.
Yeah.
So 4 of the state and federal territories that have may issue laws on their books have the highest crime rate and firearm crime rate in the entire country.
Well, it's because it's illegal. So when it happens,
exactly.
You know, I mean,
the good guys don't have guns at that point.
Exactly.
So that's California, Chicago, New York, and DC. All may issue states.
That's an interesting thought. And you know what? I think here's what I think too. With this coming out, one thing that's always been it's almost like a talking point that I try to get people to understand too is there's no peer review or statistical data showing what the difference is in between crimes that were committed that turned into homicides or classified as homicides that would have been something else, right? And the only way to test that now is by this passing. So everywhere being a shall issue state, when we can
if they're not constant carrying like Georgia.
Well, what I mean by that is, right, so now over the course of the next 5 years, we can look at does DC's gun violence rate, does Chicago's gun violence rate, California, New York, does that rate actually go down?
Mm-hmm.
Their crime rate may stay the same, right? And then that's the other part of the story is because when you look at, let's take the UK for example, right? When they did a hard crackdown on gun control, right? You still had almost the same level of violence.
Are you talking about Australia?
No, I'm talking about the UK.
UK's had a gun ban for a long
But
time.
what I'm saying is when they did theirs, you see spike over years, right? In knife violence, physical violence, things of that nature. Um, Even though like you're basically what I'm trying to say is this: the crime rate didn't drop, right? So
Mhm.
you can't blame it on guns. But so it's going to be interesting to see in these areas did the actual crime rate in where guns were used go down, and did the crime rate stay the same? Because then you can say, okay, once again, we now have a case study that you can point to that say that guns aren't the problem, which is the argument. Because anyone can come out here and say, oh, someone was able to go buy a gun, even if they went through a background check, even if they went through all this other kind of stuff, and committed all these heinous acts. Whereas once you can study the difference in between the two, then we can actually say, well, these places had gun bans for years or had heavy regulation against guns. Now we're having the good people who, like we were saying, being able to get permits and they're getting guns legally like they were supposed to beforehand. Look what happened when people now were able to drop that rate.
Yeah, because I mean, a mass shooter by definition is going to only attack areas where where they are statistically more likely to rack up the highest count that they're able to.
Yeah, because they're crazy.
Exactly. So
It's part of the mental illness.
by allowing citizens to be able to defend themselves in more places than what were able to beforehand, the mass shootings statistically and will go down.
Should go down. Mass shooting should go down. Yeah. Mass violence may stay the same, or we may see a shift, which is what I really want to see. Like from a statistical standpoint, is now that people who follow the law can get a gun and get a
Mhm.
permit for that gun in these areas, are you going to see criminals still being criminals? Because there was a time beforehand to where they were like crime rate essentially has webbed and flowed in this country for a while. It's reached a low point, but it's to a certain degree, especially in certain places, it's always going up. So there's always been some kind of a balance, right? So are we going to see the same people still do heinous acts?
Well, there was a study that was done, and I read about this. It's been years from now, and it's not a recent study where they went inside of a prison and asked convicted violent offenders if they would have committed that crime if they had thought that the person they were or persons that they were committing that crime against had been armed.
Mm,
And it was overwhelmingly no, would have done that
I'll have to go look it up.
because they are not because these people they're not interested in going in at I guess at the smaller localized criminal or the violent criminal or the violent criminal acts. They're not looking at going in and trying to kill a lot of people. They're going in, they're trying to rob somebody. They're trying to, you know,
Yeah,
they're not willing to risk their life in order to get these items to be able to have that. They're statistically more likely to hit soft targets where they know they're not armed. They know they're just going to hand over everything. So those are the areas
or
that you're
whether
going to
yeah,
really see.
the
But
risk
now
of
that people
implementation
exactly
or
well, now that people have that ability to be armed in these situations or to have the perception that they are armed in these situations, I believe that you will see a statistical fall in criminal activity.
hmm, I can't wait to see it. I can't wait for it to be done. I might do
Hmm.
that peer review.
Yeah, I mean it's a great read, and it would and I think if you were able to get that data and be able to analyze it and really to be able to interpret it, I think that would be something that would be good because there was a
To do it right, you would need to do like it needs to be like a 5-year study
hmm? Well, I mean they did that with gun violence
and then have it go through a
on
peer review
school
process.
councils or on school campuses after the Brady bill was passed, and you actually saw school violence, gun violence on school campuses go up after the Brady bill,
Yeah.
which made it federally illegal for you to have guns on K through 12 campuses.
Hmm.
you saw a
I don't
rise.
have the time to do that myself, but I would love to do it, or at least like go to an institution and see if they do it. But yeah, no, I used to love to do stuff like that.
Yeah, so it's really it's really something that I'm happy to see, and I'm glad to see this shift and this move towards that. Just simply because, again, it's the Supreme Court coming back and going towards original intent,
The
as
original intent,
opposed to
correct? Because well,
this judicial
so
activism
because when you
sense.
talk about the Second Amendment, right there's also this idea that because of the mention of the militia, in the Second Amendment, that it was supposed to be held with the militia, and that but that gets loosely too, right? Because technically, you could technically be your own militia.
Well,
Um,
in the days of the or our founding fathers, militiamen were farmers. They just lived. They lived their
correct.
life, and when called up, they had their arms to be able to respond and join.
Which is my point, right? Because like some people think of militia as like a place with an armory. No,
Yeah,
but you could be
they think of like the National Guard or the Army Reserves.
correct. You could be a militia yourself, or part of a militia, which means that I could say I'm a part of militia. You would never know it, and then I'd have my guns locked away. That being said, though, I forgot where I was going with that, but that still implies with the Second Amendment, because you should be able to get a permit if it's allowed to have a permit. Then, and that's the way that is interpreted. That if you go and say that my intent is to own a firearm, then I should be able to go get a permit like I would anything else, to build a house, to do anything else through the government. And the government should not be able to tell you maybe, maybe not. Should I have a way? Should I not?
That's not that's a very narrowly construed interpretation. Mine's a lot more broadly construed, I guess you would say, on that. When it says shall not infringe, I take that
Well, I
as
mean,
they shall not infringe.
We've had
the discussion.
Yeah,
As I mean,
I think you should be at like
privateers back during the Revolutionary War had the most advanced weaponry on the face of the
I do
planet.
kind of think there's a certain level, right? Like, I think I should be able to go up to a tank before the government says I need a permit. I know you feel that if someone's going to tell you a tank, you could park it in your front yard.
Well, I mean, if our government has it, then we should be able to have it, because the entire intent behind the Second Amendment was in case the government became too tyrannical.
Mm.
And
This is true.
it was its entire intent behind it was that if necessary, the government can be overthrown. And Joe Biden
But in
making
law enforcement, and military is a form of enforcement, should be able to go a level above its citizens.
That's only if you're looking at an authoritative type of a government.
I know,
Because if your citizenry is not as well equipped as what your enforcement mechanism is, then that enforcement mechanism always is going to have the hands up.
correct.
So that
It's a
is
very
in of
interesting
itself
conversation
is
when
an
you start
authoritative.
when you start thinking about it. Because one thing I thought about was those poor souls who thought they were going to run an Area 51. You know what I mean? Because like that's like, you want to run inside of a military base thinking that
Well,
you're
if there had been a
loot it?
million of them that have shown up there, yeah, they've been able to.
Doesn't matter. Like, yeah, they'd be able to break in, but I mean, it don't change the fact that like 3 tank shots, like majority of them are gone. Like, you know what I mean?
Well, Joe Biden
they don't
said
they don't really have any weapons. They were just running in there. Like,
well, Joe Biden did say that you silly people, when you're talking about trying to overthrow the government with the AR-15s, we have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So that in of itself, to me, was a threat against the people.
That's a threat. That's a slippery slope too. But just I'm glad that we moved towards this, and it's been a very interesting week when it comes to the SCOTUS and what the justices have done.
Mhm.
And I think our country is moving in the right direction. We're going to see the left come out and want to pack the courts, and everyone make sure that you're armed for riot season, because next is the purge. You know what I mean? Like that's it's pretty much the direction they're trying to take things. But It's interesting. Let's kind of move.
Well,
This
so
kind of like leads into what I wanted to get into earlier and what I
mhm.
stopped myself on.
Yes, and this is there's something else that just kind of popped into my head that I remembered reading today about this as well. So if you're not familiar with what we'll be discussing with this, essentially Congress has shown us why democracies are inherently
Oh, there.
going to fail,
Lemon
regardless of
pop.
throughout history, true democracies have always fallen.
Yeah, well, and so when we start talking about true democracies, we're talking about Greece, Rome
Well, Rome was a republic.
was a republic, right? But it was a little, it was a different form of republic.
It was more of you inherited seats rather than it be elected to them.
Correct. And that I'll get into that a little bit. But anyway, any form similar had the longest it's lasted is 300 years.
Well, yes, I mean, if you look after what happened with the French Revolution, that lasted 20.
Yep. So when we start talking about the long lasting of democracy, you're capping yourself at max 300 years, depending on how you want to look at the form of democracy. Um, and America, we're getting close to that, which is why this is starting to get very important that we pay attention when you have laws that are starting to be made based upon the emotions of the majority. Take whatever opinion you want to, and that can be passed in an instant. There's not a lot of thought to it, which I always go back to again when the Twin Towers went down. Outside of what is going on now, I feel like that was the last time that things this major happened that fast. And we already 20 years later are looking at, the flaws that led from that because we took such an emotional stance. I don't think that the emotional stance at the time was wrong or there's anything wrong with taking an emotional stance, right? But when you're starting to pass policy and laws that are based on that, we really need to be more careful with the implications and what comes of that.
Emotion cannot be the basis of policy. The deliberation has to be,
Very good phrase.
and that essentially is why democracies are inherently going to fail, simply because democracies are mob rule.
Which is why there's all like so. I kind of leaned into this earlier when I was
Did
talking.
you lean into it or did you lead into it?
I leaned because I was leading towards this lean of this discussion when I was talking about the damn it, Justin, you made me miss it. Where were we? ADHD is awful. When we started talking about what's unconstitutional versus what's constitutional,
Mhm.
when
Well, before we go any further on that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you again, let's at least
it's fine, take it
let's
because the
let's at
ADHD brain
least tell
left it.
people what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's fine.
So Congress passed the gun, uh, essentially the gun control laws that they had been deliberating on for the past 2 weeks. Let's graciously call it 2 weeks. They passed a sweeping, comprehensive gun reform as far as they have instituted the incentives for states to enact red flag laws, which inherently robs gun owning citizens of their due process rights. They are now opening up juvenile records to essentially look for uh, indicators and red flags and warnings as to what may produce a mass shooter. We'll call it that.
Build a
And then
profile.
yes, and they are also going to be pushing funding into mental health, which I can agree with. That is something that we need to do substantially.
Which
That's
should have been
something
the crux of
that
this.
should have been the only thing.
Should have been the crux of this.
It should have been, yeah, it should have been the absolutely only
Like we
thing. But the
disagree.
red flag law is
We agree
100%
on the
agree.
red flag thing. We slightly disagree on the what do they call it? The boyfriend loophole or
Mhm.
whatever. Because I think that that's a gap that needed to be narrowed.
Well, they did make it to where it wasn't a lifetime ban. It was only a ban, I believe, up until 5 years.
Yeah.
But even still, that's 5 years that you would have your firearms confiscated based upon an allegation that had not been uh, deliberated, and so you essentially have no due process there.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and
again,
that's
that's a
where
slippery
that's
slope.
where we slightly narrow, like, differ on this, is because the due process part is what gets me. But I think that if you show a history of violence at really any age, those are key indicators as to potentially you doing something heinous towards others. Um, that is it for me.
Well,
Now, I don't
let's take
think
a
that that should do a gun ban more so than a, maybe look at for some more mental health.
so looking from the biblical perspective. You had Saul, the persecutor of Christians, who killed Christians, stoned them, and created, and was just
He
during
was.
that time one of the worst people out there. But he had a we'll call it, for a lack, we'll call it a religious experience, just to stay above bar on some of this, where his entire personality changed and he became Paul. I mean, I even had a psychology professor tell me that somebody's personality can never change, but when presented with, say, for instance, the religious change that people have gone from have done a complete 180 in personal changes and
It's
personal traits.
it's a complete rewiring of the brain.
Exactly. So, say for instance that you had a young kid that grew up in a very rough lifestyle, was very tender, prone to violence, but then had a change. They actually matured, and they had an experience where it changed their life. Now everything they had done previously to that is now going to be held against them up until they are 23.
Well, see, I'll look at it like slightly different because, like, to me, to me, I think that, you know, we should give every person the opportunity to change.
Mhm.
And I think that we've come a long way and we can show that people do change. Um, I don't think this is something that's meant to hold people back, more so than look at some of the cases to where, okay, this person did not change. But because only a judge or certain individuals in law enforcement can look at someone's juvenile record, this person moves across country, they're above the age of 18, they no longer have a record. Um, and then they commit this act, but they commit simple assault and battery, right? They put them in jail for a while, they get out, and then they go on to do something even more heinous because there's no way of understanding or finally tracking that to know that they have incrementally increased to this point, which is a lot of times when you build a profile of individuals who create these heinous acts, there is a long list of mental instability that you can really track from childhood. Whereas if this individual had been given help or shown a different way, or to a sense had their a way for their brain to be rewired, whether it be religious or whatever, then they could have been put on a different track. Um, I think that's where my mind goes when I start thinking about looking at this. It's not so much to be used against people, but then that's the cynical side of me thinking, well, of course this is going to be used against people. Like, that's part of the reason why they're putting it in the law right now.
Yeah. So the mindset that I have with that is I would rather 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person be persecuted or having their liberties taken away from them.
It's a very bold statement.
Well,
I get it
that's
because
because
it protects the integrity.
Yes, this is something that is so deeply inhaled and deeply enshrined within not only just our country, our lifestyle, everything about us, but is historically enshrined just in the history of humankind. And to be able to say that, because without actually going through the legal process, you are going to be with your liberties are going to be withheld from you. So without actually having that due process in there, the actually inscribed due process, not just a substantive due process, you are removing somebody's liberty from them being able to enjoy the life that they should be able to have.
Yeah, I get that.
And I understand your perspective too.
Yeah, I get that. It's just
because they're the over, and
For the integrity of the
The
law.
examples that I am giving are so few and far between that
Yeah,
it's almost statistically improbable. But at the same time,
it's the baseline.
yes.
It's the and that's why I understand. For the integrity of the law, it's important that that stance remains, which still goes back to the web and flows of it. You know,
Hmm.
the data is showing something different. We as individuals feel that, you know what, like too many people are getting away with these heinous things because there's no way of actually proving it, or like there's no way to correlate it without some kind of third party evaluation. We shouldn't change the bedrock of our country for it.
Never. So I believe it was either Voltaire or it was Benjamin Franklin. It's one of the two. I can't remember specifically. Said if you give up an ounce of liberty for a pound of security, then you deserve neither.
I think that was Voltaire.
Yeah, that's what it sounded like. I think Franklin rephrased it a separate way.
He rephrased it a separate
But-
way yeah, because he pulled that. That's
But
English.
yes,
Yep.
giving up an ounce of liberty for a pound of security, you deserve neither.
Hmm.
But so let's look at what and why this is such a
Because we covered a
an
good bit of this
interesting.
on our last show, but I
Yes.
can't believe they actually passed it.
Well, it passed in the Senate, of course, along the 64 36 vote line.
And yeah,
but-
because we talked about that because it was the
Mhm.
50 Democrats signed onto it, and then you had the 14 Republicans.
Interestingly enough to note, there were 14 Republicans on the House side that voted for it as well.
Hmm.
The vote total came to 234 to 193.
Hmm. Hmm. Smell a coalition forming.
I mean, there is that possibility. And I don't specifically remember which ones, but I can imagine there were some California and some
Oh, I got
Florida and some. Well, I mean that's not something we really need to roll into specifically on that one. But going back to the principle that we
ask me. I'll give you the list.
but going back into the principle that we were talking about earlier, the whole emotional knee jerk reactions being the reason why democracies are inherently intended to fail, because we pass laws that are not deliberative; they're emotional. There's nothing now that we are passing that is actually deliberative or meant to be sustained for a long period of time. We can't even pass an actual budget. We just pass a continuing resolution.
Well, all of it's leaning. It's
Yeah.
leaning towards the majority, which, you know, a lot of people that is a democracy in itself. And once the
Mhm.
majority changes its mind, then you lean in a different direction.
Oh, well, I mean that's mob rule within itself. We're seeing less and less, or at least in my opinion, we're seeing less and less of our politicians willing to take stands to represent the people that they are actually representing. And we know that these politicians are not going to be ousted from office, or are normally not ousted from office. There are very few occasions where they are, because they are, or the incumbency carries such a heavy factor with it.
Yeah, well, you know, to dabble into that for a second, because here's the thing, right? I think there's a thought, right?
Mhm.
That how do I even say this? There's this thought of at some point there has to be some form of compromise to a certain degree. Each party has its own hard line, but we all know that statistically, you know, 68% of the country sits in the middle and votes purple. And so they really want, majority of the country wants us to get our stuff together.
Mhm.
And Justin told me I had to stop cussing, so that's why I said stuff. They want us to get our stuff together and figure out what we can compromise on and what we can't. Now, I think that there are some hard lines, and I'm using this as I'm not using this as an example, but I'm using this segment to start dabbling into this. But at some point, we really probably will have to compromise. I don't think guns is where we compromise on, but it's interesting to start to see like this, I wouldn't say naturally happening, but oddly happening right now.
Well, I mean, it is because midterms are right around the corner, so they're trying to get as much push through as they possibly can, uh, especially being led by members of Congress who are in weak seats that they don't really have a very strong footing in that, and the seat is poised to be flipped. So they're pushing a lot of these issues like that and trying to get these things rammed through and passed through.
Which I see right on both sides, right? Like if you're in a
Well, there is nothing Republican that's getting passed like this.
well, of course, because we're in the minority right now,
Hmm.
but we will once we become the majority again. But what I see is right. So let's say you're in a heavy Democratic area, you're going to start to see more of a progressive push so that they can hold their seat in the midterm. Same thing in a hard Republican seat who you may not have a hard Republican. I think a lot of times about like Lindsey Graham, right? Lindsey Graham always doubles down when it's his turn to run again.
Hmm.
And he's hit normal Lindsey Graham any other time. Um, which you always
McConnell too.
see which you always see during campaign season more so than you do anywhere else. These purple areas, though, I think they're going to be very interesting because you're going to start to see more moderate candidates from both sides.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Simply because of the way that we have our primaries set up. Because the way that primaries are ran is you always run hard to the opposite side.
But what if
And
everyone's in the middle? What if the majority of your district very slightly is shaded?
I don't think that
There aren't any right now. But do you see where I'm going with this?
I can and I do, but I don't
Because
see
we've been
that as
polarized for
a
so long.
yeah,
We've been
that is true.
polarized for so long that at some point there you're going to see more shaded pockets.
I don't think so. Polarization only increases polarization
Mm, mm-mm.
because
Eventually, there's a middle ground.
without redistricting now, because a polarized area only becomes more polarized simply because of the fact that they are seeing or just from the sense of cognitive dissonance. You're only increasing the mindset within that population, and they're doubling down and really digging into what they believe and what their beliefs and what their lifestyle is. They're entrenching themselves within that and becoming stronger, if not more ardent, into that
So
process.
I'll use this as an example, right? So Democrats believe that Georgia went blue.
Mhm.
Statistically, Georgia didn't go blue. They just voted different.
They just stole the election.
They voted differently.
They stole the election.
Voted differently.
They stole the election.
So when we look at that, I think that there are some suburban Republicans who just didn't vote down ticket Republican for the first time ever.
True, and I wouldn't disagree with that point, but to make it statistically significant, I don't think that that's where you're going to really. I don't think that that's going to be something that's really going to come out of any time or anything that we see in the near future. Simply because everything being passed now is so emotional, it's just increasing the cognitive dissonance that's being entrenched within America.
Well, and that's why, right? Begin with the end in mind, right? And the end date this time is 2028. So they polarized like well, I'll put it this way: Obama started the polarization, which led to us being even more polarized with Trump. But we went hard left, now we're going hard right. Okay. Trump started this swing to where I don't believe the country went as far left as we think we did, but more people just got upset about some mad tweets. Okay. So then we get to how Joe Biden came into effect, but he proved it that America is not wanting to do that because we see what that is, and now we're all miserable, which is why he has such a high disapproval rating, right? So we're swinging back right.
Mhm.
When we get towards 2028, I don't see us swinging back that far left as a country because we've had this such a polar swing anymore.
You're talking about the pendulum effect, essentially.
Correct.
Uh,
I don't see it. I don't see us going that way. I think that by 2028, there may be more of a middle ground movement. It'll be something we hadn't seen before. That's all I'm saying.
So in a what we'll call it a vacuum state, where you have a pendulum that is swinging back and forth and does not have gravity acting against it. If it swings as far as it swings to one side, it is going to swing back to the other side just as far. And without an actual additional amount of energy added to it, it is not going to swing any further to one side or the other.
So eventually it stops.
Well, that's with gravity acting on it, is what causes it to stop. But if you don't have gravity acting on it, it continuously flows either way.
But that's what I'm saying. Like, so you
But
using that
well,
political.
where I was going with that is the emotional responses that we're seeing is adding more energy to it, and that's the reason why we're seeing it swinging further and further and further. So it's the emotionally driven legislation that we're passing and the knee-jerk reactions that we're passing right now to things that are happening that is causing the pendulum to swing further and further to either side.
But don't you see that the people are starting to feel the weight of just all that emotion at one time, and they want us to like stop
Well,
and come up with something?
actually, I don't think that I don't think that they're wanting us to stop, but or they're wanting that effect to stop. However, I don't think that they are actually I don't think that they're going to participate in the system to where it's going to cause that stop. A lot statistically, the majority of the people just become disenfranchised. They just give up trying. They just give up caring
But that's what I'm
because
saying.
nothing they do is going to stop it, and it
What
continues
I'm
to
saying
go
is
further and further out of the way.
the what
Because the majority of the population doesn't vote.
the majority of the population doesn't vote, but those that do vote are starting to feel the weight of, I will say, the political gravity of saying that we need more middle ground.
Well, we'll see in the future because right now, that
Right now, it's not
effect
a
is not.
possibility. Right now, it's possible. Right now, it's
I
not
mean
gonna happen.
that may be something in the future that may happen, but looking how things have progressed up until this point, I don't foresee it happening unless there is a major movement within ourselves to actually apply gravity to that pendulum
Well,
and
and so
to center it
someone
out.
asked me, do I ever see this ending? And I was like, I don't see it ending till 2025, 2026. And that is because
If then,
they have pushed so far, right? That we have pushed so far to the left that we on the right feel that we have to swing back more, right? But similar to a pendulum, in politics, eventually it does stop to where, because then you have to redraw the lines always. And not necessarily the political boundaries like the great flip that everybody talks about when the Civil Rights Act came out. But I'm talking more so along the lines of, at some point, in order to fix it, there's got to be some kind of middle ground that we do agree upon. And when that ends up happening, eventually there's going to be something that comes up that we strongly disagree with each other on. And then that's going to cause the pendulum to swing again. And then we go into the tide all over again. But at some point, there's going to be a boundary or a couple years that the majority of the time that everyone's okay and we agree with each other. I don't see that happening until 2026, leading into 2028.
so I guess the only time that would come to mind that was something that actually happened would probably have been the 1950s.
Mm-mm. No,
Because when would be a good example?
I would say the 50s. Then I would say mid 90s. Then
I
again,
would disagree
mid
with that.
2000s.
I would disagree with that simply because of the fact that you started to see a massive uprising in the 90s within the free speech movement, which started to swing things very strongly to the left.
But around 95, 96, when we started to, when you really got technical colleges, there was a somewhat calming, similar to 2005 ish, right? Everyone was okay. There were some things that people didn't like, right? Remember, everybody remembers Kanye, George Bush don't like black people, right? That's around that same era. But for the majority of the country, everyone was like, I can live with this. Same thing with Bill Clinton up until, he had the Lewinsky incident.
Well,
We haven't had that kind of, but we've been more polarized since then, which is what everyone feels is this whole downpull towards democracy.
well, in the grand scheme of what, almost 250, 260 years of a life of a country, it's a 2-year time span is not the statistically significant aspect of stopping it because of the fact it may have just been slowed down to the middle just enough to where it picked back up to go back to the other side.
I mean, if we really dabble, we can look at different periods.
Well, I mean,
You know what I
that's
mean?
why I
Like,
gave about a 10-year time period during the 50s.
you can go back to other times, like just looking at the whole country before there was the uprising of are slaves people or not. That was the same thing. There was a certain level of peace there. There's more of an uprising after that, and then you had the whole large pendulum swing. Each time before a era of peace, there is a war, and then you go back to it
Yes, kind of.
because
I
the
would say
conflict has
more
to
of a
peak.
social war than anything
The
else.
conflict has to peak.
Mhm.
The last time in this country that it actually like peaked to an internal war was the Civil War, which is
Yes.
why it's the Civil War. Now, ever since then, though, you still had the pendulum swing, and then you had eras of peace. We hadn't had I guess you could say, right after World War I,
But
there was a golden era
the
right before the
the
crash.
ideal is, or the ideal scenario is that there is no more hills and valleys. It's all just plain.
They will never reach utilitarian. Well,
That's not you. I mean,
utopian
that's not
society.
utopian.
There's no more hills and valleys. That's utopia.
no. That's utopia is everybody's getting along. Everybody's providing for everybody. It's a very
It's a level of peace.
no. Utopia is all about everybody. It's essentially an upward form of communism in a sense. No,
Mm,
no, it's exactly what a utopia is.
no, not. Mm-mm.
Mhm. Yep. Uh, but
I don't equate utopia to. I equate utopianism as to everyone is okay with each other. Like there's still always there's always going to be conflict. There's never a time where you're going to have conflict, regardless of the form of government that you're under. What I'm saying though is it's not as extreme as communism, where there is, I guess you could say, always there is only sea level. Like, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um,
Well, it's only sea level because you have the government with a boot on top of it pressing down.
correct. Until that is overthrown. I don't think that that is utopianism. I think utopianism is to where we say, okay, we may disagree, but we found a way to mitigate.
But you're all but with the utopianism or the utopia mindset behind it, you also are bringing in the aspect of there is no overarching form of a governance. Everybody gets along with everybody at that point in time.
There's always
And
that.
well, I mean, that's essentially what utopia is self-governance and everybody getting along to the point where there's no need for any sort of
I
governance.
don't think utopianism can really equate to there not being any government,
Look it up.
because there's still a peace level. Like, I mean, like okay, like there is a
I'm
textbook
talking about the
definition of it.
textbook definition.
There's
of
a
it,
textbook
yes.
definition of it, but when people start thinking about what is a peaceful place, like there is still a ranking order. I don't think humans we can go without having some form of ranking order, right? But we digress, right? We've been
Jamie thinks he's better than everybody talking about this ranking order stuff.
no, please.
Well, anyway,
I ain't
let's
being
get
near the
on
totem
to
pole.
Buck's getting a little insistive here. So let's jump into our to the last topic that we were talking about discussing here, and that's how Buck told us he has uncontrovertible proof that Joe
Undeniable.
Biden
Yeah.
incontrovertible. That's what
Yeah, there we go. There
incontrovertible
we go.
proof that Joe Biden is senile. And so what he told us about was essentially what the Biden administration is pushing now involving Title IX. And for those of you who are not aware, Title IX is under the essentially Civil Rights Act. It is a protection that is placed within society, workplace, governance, anything along that line, outside of public, outside of the public, anywhere that you have government regulations.
This is what really like increased girl sports. To be clear,
Yes, it actually made it to where women could actually have their
so
own
like
sports.
for most places, most schools, universities,
But
things.
let's
Go ahead.
yeah, let's finish. Tell everybody what it is first.
Go ahead.
But so essentially, it protects. It essentially says you cannot discriminate based upon the sex of the person. So women cannot be discriminated against within for employment, for sports, for anything within these regulated areas. So what Joe Biden is doing is they are coming in and they are going to, or they're advocating for the legally changing or the interpreting of what sex is. So sex is uncategorically binary. It's male, female,
Based on your
XX,
chromosome.
XY. Yeah, that is sex.
So like what I was
Gender
saying
too,
was,
in my opinion. But
what I was saying was before we go any further, like anytime a new male sport is created, there has to be a female equivalent or a new female sport created, so that if the opportunity is still there, all of that is because of Title IX.
yes,
So when we start looking at, when you say that you have boy and girl lacrosse, things like that. So
so essentially, what the Biden administration is advocating for on this is the redefining of what sex is. And they're doing this in a legal sense, so it becomes enforceable by law.
Because then sex becomes gender, and
that's
then
exactly what it is. Yeah, they're
then,
redefining sex to where it is no longer binary; it is the spectrum.
Because if they change sex to gender, then those people, I'm not going to say it. Yeah,
the alphabet.
Yeah, can determine what gender they are, and then based upon their gender, they can play a certain sport or be involved in a certain activity.
Or sue you because you weren't inclusive for them for what they were feeling at that point.
What was that? What were we talking about? Was that New York?
Yeah.
So like we were talking about this a couple days ago or something like that.
Loudoun County schools as well.
To where like you can in certain places, if I didn't know
New York City,
that you could, if you do not use the pronouns that someone wants you to use, regardless of sex, then they can sue you up to.
No, you're not being sued.
You can be fined. You can be fined up to $250,000.
Yes.
So imagine like being down the street, get into an argument with someone, like just road rage or something like that, and you call what looks like a male, a man, or dude, or anything that is supposed to be related to a man. That person could sue you, and depending on what county or state you're in, they could win because you didn't know their pronouns.
I mean,
that's a little exaggerated, but that's pretty much it.
Well, I mean, you're not far off. I'm wondering what's going to happen to Joe Biden once they actually do this, because his favorite saying, "Come on, man," and he says that to American populace.
Yeah.
So under that, he's discriminating against several people in the populace.
Come on, man, and bro, I kind of equate to.
Well, that's your truth.
I know.
That is your truth.
You're funny. It's kind of like Good Burger. Like, you know what I mean? I'm a dude, he's a dude, she's a dude, we're all dudes. Like, I kind of equate bro and come on, man to that. But
but again, that is your personal truth. And as we found out, truth is relative.
Yeah. It's all based on your own opinion.
So essentially what they're doing is by destroying these protections and on this deal it's not only are they legally redefining what sex is, they are also just essentially coming in and removing the massive amount of headway that women have made over the years. I mean, women have fought in tooth and nail to get to where they are. And by coming in and redefining this, they are essentially saying that, hey, it doesn't matter whatever you are. Still, if somebody says something wrong that you don't like.
What a crazy week this past week has been.
It's been very interesting.
You know what I mean? Because think about it. So when you start to think about the fact that Joe Biden and that administration is trying to change it to where there is no sex role. They're taking the whole chromosome scientific argument out of the equation and they're basing it upon gender. But then the left still wants to fight for the right for a woman's right to an abortion on a federal level. But then they can't define what a woman is. But then we have guns and gun restrictions come in. But now in these areas that put these restrictions in, they still have to issue a permit to the people who own these guns. What?
Well, you're
What?
taking a lot of
That's a lot to take in.
you're taking a lot of liberty with some of that as well, because you are assuming that a woman is the only person that can get pregnant.
I'm not assuming. I'm not assuming.
I mean, that's
like,
their
that's
argument. You are making the assumption that only women can be pregnant,
well,
and then you are and
I'm so confused. That's why if you've noticed, like I've been like kind of lost this whole show. It's because like when we start talking about this, and I'm like, I try to unpack every show in my head beforehand, and like it's so hard to unpack all of this because when you sit down and you think about it, and you got to go through the cases and look at it, and then you try to like put it like somewhat relatable and correlated, and then you're like, this is not even correlating.
reality. This is not
Not
reality.
reality, right? Because like when you look, like we always try to base not just what this week's show is on, each week's show is on is about like what's going on, but the order everything is based upon like how it all kind of makes sense, right? So when you get here and you're like, this man does not want to, this man wants to change sex to gender, but then we're going to say that gender is whatever you want it to be based upon how you feel on the inside as a person. But that day. But women or birthing people, right? Because that's the new term, right? Birthing people determine that they are upset because traditional defined. I can't even do it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, whatever.
Well, it's not
What
for
a week.
rational people.
I don't even think it's for irrational. I always kind of.
Well, I mean, that's kind of where.
Like, see, that's kind of
what we
crazy.
are.
See, that's even kind of crazy to me. Like, you know what I mean? For the longest time, people put me in the irrational category. And now, like, I'm in the rational category. I was laughing with a very close friend of mine, who I've known since I was like wee ha. And we were laughing because when we first came into politics, you know, when her husband is a representative, and when we first came into politics, like we were the outsiders, you know, like he ran on being an outsider. Now we're being labeled establishment. Like, how does, like, you know what I mean? This is the same thing. Like, how do we go to a point to where we can not only not define what a woman is, but we actually want to take the term woman and man out of the equation. And then you tell me to follow and listen to the science, but then you want to take the science out of it. What? I don't understand.
Welcome to 2022.
I'm done here.
So
I've literally spent
Jamie's leaving.
I've literally spent the last 80 minutes like really trying to like take it in, impact it, like, you know what I mean? Like really, really make sure I can wrap my head around it, because when you start hearing everything on the news and all that, like I still don't know.
Oh, well, I guess that's
my
good
cue,
enough
right?
a point to take it off on this one, as always. But as we always like to take time to at the end of every show to say, make sure you like and share all the content of ours that you see that we produce and put out there. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to all of our platforms. By doing that, by liking, sharing, subscribing, you're really helping us to be able to grow and to get higher up into the news feed, and really able to get this in front of more people's eyes, and to really hopefully be able to spread the message that we have even further. And go to the website that you see on the screen in front of you. And if you're able to, hit the sponsor tab in the upper right hand corner or the lower right hand corner and help us out with what you're able to. Every bit of it goes an incredibly long way. And it all comes in and it all goes right back into the show here.
And I usually don't do this, but I want to say this too. Like, comment what you think about what's going on, because here's my
Yes.
thing right now. This is very confusing. This is a confusing time to live in America. I mean, like, they don't want us to define what a woman is, but they want the rights of birthing people to be protected. And the last time I checked, based on the science, the only people who can give birth are women. So whatever. I'm gonna do my favorite part. Like, 42 days now until we beat Stacey Abrams, and we can put all this garbage to bed, because
For another year,
for
for at least a year.
for a little while at least, right? Like, I need like a vacation from this, because like, what in the world is going on? I can't imagine someone who even believes this being my governor. Whatever. Chop on, go Brian Kemp.
And as always, thank you for listening to the show. Tune back in next weekend. We'll have more. Uh, we'll be producing more and more of these special editions as things come out and come along. So thank you, and
I hope y'all wrapped your head around this more than I did.
and we'll see y'all later. Bye.